Good morning. This is Jason Dean coming live at you again for another Film Fanatic show. It is Tuesday at about 10:48. Another rainy, overcasty day here in Midcoast, Maine. So it is what it is, but it's technically springtime. So it hasn't been super warm. It's been pretty chilly. But hey, it is what it is. And yeah, so always love to thank people coming on board to subscribe to this wacky channel here that's called Film Fanatic. And yeah, keeping the train going here. Always trying to come up with new ideas and to always, bring movies to the table, especially films that a lot of folks might not have heard of before, or movies that I've discovered in my travels, movies that I find totally endearing and just whole lot of fun. And that movies that are a tremendous source of inspiration for me. So I always talk about the influence of film for me as a writer. Recently, I've been on a pretty cool tear as far as writing new material, and that's for my band Quantum. That's really the only band I have a few handful of different projects, bands that I play in, and Quantum's always been kind of my little baby, my little odd little outlet that I've had for a long time. And since I started the band, I more or less switched gears a lot as far as writing. I started just thinking in terms of writing music in the electronic, in the more or less in the electronic world, like making that more where that's kind of the space I was always in, and that's what I wanted to pursue to kind of cultivate that and to try to just build upon it. And at first, it was a thing of where I really, I guess, proactively was or consciously going into it, like thinking, okay, I'm gonna just try to write music in this realm, in the electronic world. And at first, it was like that the first couple of years, and then it evolved to where it felt more of a natural thing for me when I got really into the idea of trying to think about melody more as far as music goes. I used to, when I first started writing music for my band Quantum, I used to think of it more from the perspective of my, more or less my background, being a drummer, and that's still my main instrument. So I used to come up with rhythmic ideas and percussion ideas and things like that. And usually that would be the base of how I would start tunes. But then I really started to change my mindset about how to write songs and found some new ways that I wanted to explore, and got kind of hip to certain things around melody. I've been working over the last handful of years working a lot on my singing in the band and also my piano playing, keyboard playing. And so I've gotten it to a point where I've at least developed my ear to to a, to a certain level to where I can really tell when something is in key or not, or when I can kind of create a melody that works or doesn't work. I Once I kind of discovered that, I started to focus on that, and it evolved to where now, like, if I write music, I always think of melody first and foremost. But then over a period of time, also, it became a natural thing for me as far as wanting to kind of write in that style. And then at that same time, it wasn't like a preconceived thing anymore. Oh, that I only have to write in the electronic world. It became a thing of where I started to try to bring in other influences. A lot of music that I'm inspired by that is not non-electronic. It can be everything from folk or rock or punk rock or whatever it is, ambient music. all kinds of stuff, world music, Latin music, and I started to open up those doors a little bit more, at least for myself, as far as trying to dump in those influences, also bring those things to the table, things that are non-electronic. And it's helped the process for me a lot as far as like, trying to broaden the palette of the sound that we have as a band, try to bring more variety. Sometimes that happens, when you're in, say like if you're in a punk band, or you're in, if you're doing, a very genre specific group. Sometimes that happens, and it's a natural thing. But a lot of the times, like that particular artist, like say if you're, starting, you have this house music project, for instance. So during that time that you're creating this thing, you're kind of only listening to a lot of house DJs, and you're listening to a lot of that kind of a thing, soaking that in and getting an influence, which is a natural thing that we all do as writers. And then if you're also like, say writing folk music, you're going to be probably immersing yourself in, or being keen to checking out stuff in that style. But what I decided to do is, as well as listening to those styles of music in the electronic world, I've always listened to all kinds of music, but I've started to really try to broaden my scope of things, where I'll spend lots of time listening to music that is non-electronic, and then also trying to like pick up on ideas, in those various styles, and then also trying to bring those influences into the music, to try to I don't know, maybe keep the music fresh, and broaden the horizons a little bit. So I feel like I started making that transition, things got a little bit easier. And I like to think, and it's subjective, but I like to think when that kind of transition happened for me, the music got a little bit more. There was more music more variety to the music. So where I spent there was a time where I spent a long time listening to. I've always been a huge fan of jazz, and jazz is a huge thing of what I listen to. But I spent a long time listening to just a lot of jazz, and I started to feel like that was kind of seeping into the music. So I started doing that with lots of different kinds of music, to try to broaden the sound, the sonic kind of thing of what we're doing. So it's been a lot of fun, and the same thing with films. I immerse myself in a certain world. The world I mostly immerse myself in is the world of exploitation, and I've found, since I have really fallen in love with that whole genre, and it's something I've always loved, but I've just really taken a deep dive, and realizing the variety within that genre, and that style of filmmaking. I feel like that's kind of been a big influence in, hopefully broadening, making the sound a little bit more broad as to what we try to do with Quantum. So today's show is a movie that I think is an exploitation masterpiece. It's one of my favorite. I've talked a lot about Herschell Gordon Lewis. Herschell Gordon Lewis has. I discovered Herschell Gordon Lewis not all that long ago, probably about 4 or 5 years ago, and he is, I think without a doubt, one of the most iconic directors in the world of horror exploitation specifically, but exploitation in general, but mostly with horror exploitation movies. I feel like he is like for what it's worth, I think he was like, I don't know, the Steven Spielberg or the Stanley Kubrick of the exploitation world. I really feel like he was, you know, way ahead of the time, way ahead of his time, and a real kind of punk rock pioneer in that style. I think I think without his films and what he did and the whole way he kind of went about creating his films, I think movies would be probably quite a bit different as far as exploitation movies go. And I have totally fallen in love with Herschel Gordon Lewis over the past few years. I have most of his movies now on Blu-ray. this is one that I picked up about 2 years ago. Color Me Blood, Color Me Blood Red, and it came out in 1965. And one of the coolest things, my favorite subgenre, if you want to call it that, in the world of exploitation is the slasher genre. I love the slasher genre to death. That's my favorite, uh, probably my favorite genre or style of filmmaking of all time. If you give me a good slasher movie, copious amounts of blood with a bunch of teenagers in it who are going to get slaughtered, and a little bit of bad dialogue, some really great music, really cool atmosphere, I'm a happy camper. That's all I need. I don't need anything else to make me happy. So I feel like Herschell Gordon Lewis was a pioneer in that field because he was the first guy to really show copious amounts of gore and blood on the big screen. And I feel like, Color Me Blood Red is 1965, and I consider this to be one of the earliest slasher films that I've come across. It's 1965, and it's essentially it's about this painter who goes through this, horrible kind of personal crisis where he can't really paint anymore. So he ends up like having these thoughts of, of killing someone or killing these women. But then after he kills these women, he starts using their blood for his in his paintings. It's a kind of a the premise and storyline is pretty messed up, and so he ends up using the blood from these people, these women that he ends up killing, and he uses their blood for his paintings, and then he ends up becoming like really successful. He ends up selling a lot of paintings, and there's like all of this, all these like scenarios in this story of where when before he becomes essentially this like slasher or serial killer, he starts getting rejected. He at one point as a painter has a pretty decent level of success, but then he hits this roadblock and a lot of his newer work gets rejected, and so he ends up killing these women, and then he uses their blood for these various paintings, and it's and then he submits them to these art galleries, and he's in contact with these various art dealers, and they love his stuff. They just fall in love with it. They're enamored with it, and suddenly his paintings start selling like crazy. So the whole premise of the story is just crazy, and it's pretty gory. Like considering this movie came out in '65, Herschell Gordon Lewis, Blood Feast being probably the most important movie he ever did, or the most successful movie that he's ever done in his career. And that movie really unleashed the world of gore to to American audiences, and also European audiences. He really was the first one to put splatter or gore on the film, on the big screen. And he predated a lot of the slasher films that came out in the early 80s and late 70s by a good 10 to 15 years, even more. This is 65. So when you think of like when the first Friday the 13th movie came out, or Halloween, or things like that, it's pretty wild how ahead of his time as far as that goes, how kind of a pioneer he was. But at the same time, calling Herschell Gordon Lewis, and I've talked about it. I've done a bunch of reviews on his films in the past for this channel, and calling him an artist, or putting him in a in the same banner or in the same collection of, like, say, Stanley Kubrick, or Francis Ford Coppola, or Scorsese would be pretty iffy. But it's a different style, and I look at what Herschell Gordon Lewis, what he did. I look at him as like, I've often made the analogy of like the exploitation world being kind of like a punk rock kind of thing, or like aesthetic, or it has a punk rock aesthetic where They just, you have these guys that just go into the room and they just press record and they just like really filled with passion. They don't really know what they're doing. They might not be the most proficient musicians, but it's the love and the passion, and they're just going for it. They're not going to spend 30 hours doing 100 takes of each track, and they're just doing it, and it's really raw. It's in your face, but it has this sincerity to it. It has this passion behind it, and I feel like that's what Herschell Gordon Lewis was. He didn't have necessarily your typical skill set, that a filmmaker usually has or should have to make a film. But with him, it was like he just did it. He just made these films, and he made a shit ton of films over the span of like 15 years or so. And and I think he had a style. I think he had a style, and I feel like he created a legacy for what it is. Even though he was a carny man. He was in the world of exploitation, and he was in the business of trying to make money because he realized there was an audience back in the day of like the grindhouse cinema or cinemas where people wanted to see, naked women on the screen, and blood and violence, and just, the whole like campy, carny, world kind of being thrown at you. And he realized that early on that people wanted something different that was to a degree anti-Hollywood, and he milked that bad boy as hard as he could. And so he popped out so many movies. It's just like crazy. Dave Friedman, who was also a real famous producer, who's an awesome figure in the world of exploitation. He's one of my favorites too. I did a film review of She Freak, which is a movie he wrote, which is an awesome movie. It's basically like well, it came out in the late '60s, but at the time it was basically like a remake of the classic movie from the '20s called Freaks, and it's centered on this carnival environment, and it's just awesome. But it's essentially a remake, and he wrote this movie She Freak, and it is such a killer movie. But Dave Friedman mostly what he was known for was a producer, and he worked a long time with Herschell Gordon Lewis, producing a lot of his films, and also really promoting his films. And he was, before he moved into the horror exploitation world, he worked on lots of like kind of adult films or porn films, sex exploitation films. So he came out of this like really murky kind of dark world, where and it was really shady. But then he started becoming a partner with her. When he became a partner with Herschel Gordon Lewis, they moved fully on into the horror exploitation world, and just great. And I remember there's a really great interview that that I had seen with Dave Friedman. He was saying, well, like, if in terms of what they were doing, if they had the budget that, say a big blockbuster Hollywood film, like, I don't know, $100,000 or $1 million, he would essentially make, if he had that kind of money, he would make about 100 movies with that. He wouldn't just take that money and make one big movie. They would still kind of maintain that same work ethic and do things as cheaply as possible, and then just crank them out. And I just think that's awesome. Even if they, in the cra- crazy scenario, like if, and it would never happen to them, but if they were presented by some big, given all this money by a major studio, they would just put out a bunch of movies as opposed to one. And this movie is just so awesome. It's one of the first. I definitely consider this movie to be a slasher movie. It's also very much about a serial killer, obviously, but it's fantastic. There's so many great these collections. This is all put out by Arrow. Arrow has released all of the Herschel Gordon Lewis movies, all pretty much independently, and I have most of them on DVD. I've seen, or I'm sorry, on Blu-ray, and I've seen most of the movies in my travels where they sell like the Herschell Gordon Lewis box set, where it's basically, all of his movies, and he had a lot of movies, 50 to 100 movies, maybe more at one point. Super prolific, and I've always passed on those. I when I because I always wanted to buy his movies like independently. When I came across and these are the releases that Arrow put out, which is Arrow's a really great exploitation company. They put out all of his movies individually at really great prices on Blu-ray, and they're just packed with so many wonderful special features. All these awesome interviews, and a lot of them come with additional movies. So you're getting like two movies for the price of one, and the artwork is just great. These are some of the most amazing packages, and so I that's how I've been collecting his movies and buying them. That's the only way to go, because I know if you get the box set of like all the Herschel Gordon Lewis movies together, there's the restoration isn't quite as good. There's barely any special features. If there is, it's pretty minuscule, and you don't get those bonus movies. So this is the way to go. And considering how crappy these movies were done, like from a technical side and the condition of these films, and seeing them restored on Blu-ray 4K is just astounding, and the quality is amazing. Like, it's so unbelievable. But this is one of my favorites. I love his films. Blood Feast is probably my favorite. Wizard of Gore is so great. The first Herschel Gordon Lewis movie I ever saw was 2000 Maniacs. Awesome movie, but so many great movies. So many great movies. She Devil on Wheels. I mean, the list is endless. The Wizard of Gore. It's just great. But this is a really killer movie, pun intended, and it's super fun. It's super fun, super gory. It's super gory. Super incredibly low budget, super sleazy, super ridiculous, and it's everything you want from the exploitation world. So I highly, highly recommend this movie. Color Me Blood Red, 1965, prime time exploitation right here. And if you're a fan of horror exploitation, but if you're a fan of like the slasher genre, serial killer kind of thing, this is one of the earliest movies that I've tracked down in my time that predates a lot of the more well-known slasher movies. And I definitely consider this to be a slasher film. So, yeah, killer stuff. So this is Jason Dean. Thanks again for your support. Keep the comments coming, and check this movie out. And Herschel Gordon Lewis rules. Thanks again, and we will see you soon. Peace.